You're with Jason at True Vintage. Thanks very much for choosing to stop in and check out this Storm 2000 Stadium Truck video on the channel today. So here we are. I've got a new in-box kit here and I want to build a new built Storm 2000 truck or stadium truck for track use. So what I wanted to do is get this new in-box kit out onto the channel and show the viewing audience what one of these things actually looks like, because you don't see them very often. Here we are. So let's lift the lid of the box. And inside of this kit box we have a Cougar 2000 manual. So clearly the truck is based off that, but then we also have what I think is some kind of addendum, and what that does is it actually shows you the difference between the Cougar 2000 buggy and then the truck, and makes the changes in there. So they didn't reprint an entire manual as far as this kit goes. Now, I don't know if they did one eventually or what, but anyway, Schumacher was sort of well known for that kind of thing. We have some window masks, and we also have the Storm decal set. So these just look exactly like the Schumacher Storm that came on the alloy pan years before, which was basically like a Cougar, an alloy pan Cougar. So they haven't, it doesn't look to me like there's any 2000 specific decals in there, but that's cool. That's just how they roll. So inside of the kit, there's obviously this big long rectangular box here, and that's going to hold all of the parts in order to build this truck. We have this Lexan body. And yeah, that is the Storm truck body. So that was used in the alloy pan Storm, which must have come out, I'm going to say, late 80s. And I've had a few Club 10 trucks and they've had the same body set in that kit, which is just very reminiscent of what I'm looking at right here now. It's been many years since I've had those kits, but there was a time when I had 3 of those Storm truck body kits. So there's the Lexan body. Blue dot stadium truck tyres, which I don't think would be very good for racing nowadays, but that's what you used to get with this truck back then. We've also got the dished wheels. The Storm truck runs on a hex system, so I think it's a 15mm hex. I'll have to double check that, but from memory that's what I recall. And a dual bearing front wheel. And all of these black fiberglass components that make up the chassis. So anyway, that's what I can show you on camera here right now. But how about we take the rest of this over to the bench behind me and we'll have a deeper look into what's in this kit. Now we're over onto the workbench, and I'm just going to have a bit of a look through some things here. And underneath the ring light, I'm having a bit of a flick through the Cougar 2000 buggy manual. So this is kind of how it was done back in the day, and it's accompanied of course by the Storm 2000 supplementary manual, and they work in conjunction with one another just to try and give you a broader view of how this truck goes together. And you've got to kind of flick between the two manuals in order to actually build this truck, and it's just how manufacturers did this back in the day. So I don't think the Storm 2000 was ever designed to be a standalone design. It just borrowed many parts from the 2000 buggy, and this confirms it also. So a bit of a nice bonus, but we've got some Cougar 2000 decals and some Storm truck decals. So yeah, they've just basically given you both, and I guess you kind of mash them up and make up a design on your truck body that perhaps suits your own taste. So anyway, 2 decals, so that's not bad. And inside this slip here, we have the window mask. So after you've trimmed out your body, washed it and cleaned it and dried it, you will apply these decals on the inside of the windows, and that stops you from painting in what you'd like to be clear windows. Now in this package here, we have all of the black fiberglass components, such as the lower chassis, the upper deck, the shock towers, the link mounts, things like that. And now onto the Storm truck body. I'm a bit of a fan of this design. I really like it. They have continued using this design. It was used in the early Schumacher STORM truck kits, and it even was implemented in the Nitro 10 kits, and of course now the STORM 2000 truck kit. Onto these tyres now. You'll notice there are no foam inserts of this because these things are very, I'm not going to say too hard, but they are a bit hard. They're not very rubbery. They're more like plastic. And now onto the rim. So this is the rear rim, and there is a big hex drive in the rear, which drives the rear rim. And of course, on the front rim, I think it's an 8mm OD bearing that actually, you get two bearings in those front rims. But let's slide these off to one side and let's get into the really good stuff. So inside of this rectangular box are all the rest of the components that needed to build up this truck. So here we go. The first bag I'm going to take out of this box is one of the shock absorber bag sets. So there are two bag sets in this truck, and they're both long shocks. So they're the Pro olive green shock absorbers. They're best shocks they did from back in the day, of course. And now we're going to pull this bag out, and in this bag we've got the rear suspension and bulkhead and hubs and pivot blocks, all those things that make up the whole rear end of the car. And in this bag we are onto the front suspension, and it's got the big wide front bulkhead in that side. You can see it there as well. Front suspension arms, the hubs, the steering components, yep, they're all in there. Now onto this bag, and that's the second bag of shock absorbers. So yeah, they run long shocks front and rear on this truck. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see this thing go together. Now, in this bag here, we've got the body mounting set. So these posts and blocks just screw to the shock towers and they hold the body in place. Universal for Schumacher, they use them on lots of things. And the transmission bag, so there's the transmission cases, and you've got the red alloy motor mount. And of course, I noticed that the ball diff was already assembled, so that's kind of cool. You don't always see that, not from back then anyway. Now, this is the battery strap that runs down the center of the car, and this sprue here is the chassis gates, and these allow the lower chassis to be screwed to the upper chassis deck. And in this package we have the rear motor guard and other components such as Velcro straps and bits and bobs. And now we're on to the servo mounting brackets. So these are like an L-shaped mounting bracket, and this last package is now just spare supplementary bits like washers, screws, nuts, things like that. And getting down to the last of it now, we have got the aerial. Back in the day, we used to have big aerials, that's right. And that's the Lexan gear cover. Not easy to find those things over the years, but yeah, that's obviously an original Lexan gear cover. Now, this is the last component, and this is a Lexan ESC mount that usually goes above the back rear section of the battery there. And to one side, you would drill a hole through this Lexan here, and that would be where you'd mount your club transponder. So before they had personal transponders, you used to have a hole and then a hook pin, and that's where it went. So yeah, anyway, that's it. That's what's in that box. But who's excited to actually see a Storm truck getting built? So flicking back and forth between the Schumacher Cougar 2000 and the Storm 2000 manuals, we're going to put this build together. And we're going to start out here with the 7-cell slot lower chassis plate, and these are the chassis gates which tie the top plate to the lower chassis plate. And I'm making note here that Schumacher has these posi drive screws, and I'm not really about that, so I've swapped that out for some stainless hex drive hardware which I keep my own stocks of, and those are the chassis gates already fastened to the lower chassis plate. Now onto these L-shaped steering servo brackets, and for the purpose of this video I'm just building as per the manual, so I haven't chosen any electrics yet. I'm just installing all the parts together to build the car as per the manual as best I can. So now on to the ball diff for the rear. So I've applied a little bit of grease there to the diff ring, and I'm going to apply some more of this, of course, silicone diff grease into those openings where the diff balls will go, and as you can see, I'm just spreading them around now and putting them into each of their locations. Now I'm going to be tying the two diff halves together, and these little white pieces snap into the side of the diff center, and I'm winding now in the thrust race. So much like say an associated stealth transmission, the Schumacher uses a similar design 3 gear, and it's interesting to note that they have quite a fine pitch of those gears, whereas I'm going to be looking into some Fireblade gear sets because they're a bit coarser and apparently they're a bit more reliable. So now I'm just pushing in these extension pieces which go into the steel outdrives, and what they do is they allow the slider drive shafts to come further out of the diff center, so it's just an extension because of the wide track. And onto the lay shaft here, there's the cross pin, and these are just some foam gaskets that will go into place, and they'll just offer some sort of protection from dust that might get into the transmission through that lay shaft. And screwing on the red anodized alloy motor plate, and now the slipper assembly, and there is the slipper pad and the external piece of the slipper there, just making sure that everything fits nicely. Now onto the thrust race, and this time using molybdenum disulfate grease to lube all of the thrust balls, and they're all going into place, and the unit's being put onto that lay shaft now. And on with the adjustment spring and an M3 nut. I'm going to tighten that down and make that ready to accommodate the spur gear. So yeah, winding that down just gently. Everything spins nice and freely, everything's true. And I'm starting out with a 95 tooth Whisper spur gear, and we're going to worry about the gear ratios later on. So to run this Storm truck in the vintage Bash, it will be a 17.5 brushless motor. And here's the finer details here of how the slider drive shafts go into these out drives, and they'll have 2 grub screws that wind into that steel section, and yeah, they locate it like that. Now onto the front caster blocks. So these are adjustable there, as you can see, so these just slide into place and they can be swapped out depending on what caster you would like to go for. And the stub axle here going into the steering upright, and just popping the E-clips here onto that pivot pin, and just snapping that into place with a pair of pliers. And again the lower E-clip, and yep, she's in there. So yeah, it's easy to have those things go flying across the room, so just be careful as you're assembling those. But yeah, nice and smooth, all goes together. That's the right and the left. Now onto the front suspension arms. So what we've done here is I've already assembled the left hand. I'm going to be assembling the right hand, and the same thing, just sliding the hinge pin through the lower section of the C-hub, and yep, that's all done. Now onto the front bulkhead. So the big difference between the Storm 2000 versus the Cougar 2000 is the width of the bulkheads, and of course the shock towers are different. That's all assembled now, and I'm fastening the parts of the body mounting system there to the shock towers, and that's the assembly all screwed together. Yep, looking good. Lots of travel there, everything's nice and free, no binding. It's good to check those things ahead of time. Now onto the front steering setup here for the bell cranks, and of course this red anodized alloy post here locks into the lower section of the steering bell cranks, and everything slides together very nicely. And of course this is the servo saver, And even though it is a servo saver, I tend to wind these things tightly down and end up running a Kimbrough servo saver on the servo itself. And I did initially try and run some bearings on these, but I didn't have the right size, so I've just gone back to the bronze bushings, which are still perfect for this application. Got one up inside of that alloy tube there, and that all slides together, and yep, it's all ready to go. Now winding that down into the bulkhead, and there is an M3 screw nut in the bottom size of that bulkhead. Same thing with the offside. Yeah, just tightening it down, making sure everything runs, or everything works nice and smoothly, so no binding. There's the drag link, and now we're getting ready to assemble the steering bell crank bulkhead to the lower chassis plate, winding it all down nicely there with some M3 taper screws, and now onto the upper deck. So that slots the steering servo saver, comes through the top of the upper chassis plate there, and has an extra bracket to hold it in place. Now fastening it all together, so the front bulkhead now is being attached to the chassis plate, so this carries the whole front suspension assembly. Everything's going together nicely. Now let's look at the camber links and steering rods, and I'm just double checking there that the measurements are correct as per the manual, and just snapping those steering links onto the ball studs. There we go, all done. Now onto the rear camber link plate. So this section just installs and is fastened into and carries the rear of that top deck. Now onto the transmission and the rear suspension assembly, and these are different toe-in blocks that slide into the rear hubs, and they allow you to adjust how much toe-in the truck will have at the rear. So just popping the bearings into place there, and winding the ball studs down and holding them with nylock nuts. There are spacers here for the rear hubs, so you could adjust the length of the track by moving those spacers fore or aft, and that's how the assembly goes together. Now onto the rear brace. So this section, actually sorry, this is the front brace, so this actually holds the front of the assembly together, and that installs onto the chassis first, and that's just going to hold and strengthen any potential weaknesses in those inner pivot blocks by having a brace that goes across the front of those hinge pins. Now I'm winding some screws all the way through, and I'm installing the transmission now, and you've got 2 screws at the top and 2 screws at the bottom, and that holds that into place. And there is a rear plate also, and what I'm doing with this one, I'm putting a bit of thread lock on there. And thank you very much, Piers. This is the little spanner that you were handing out at the Vintage Bash 2022, and yep, it's come in handy yet again. So I have found many uses for that little spanner, but yeah, I'm not running nylocking nuts because I don't want the any potential for that drive shaft to be rubbing on those, so I'm using low profile nuts. And onto the hex drive and the nut there, I'm just going to slip those on there just for now until I get the wheels on. Now take a note that these ball studs are directional, so on they go. Now let's get into the shock absorbers. Let's crack open these little beauties, and they are both long shocks front and rear, so they're not a medium length front, they are a long rear that go up onto the front. And look at me wrangle those bits out onto the bench and laid them all out there. Yeah, gorgeous Teflon coated shock bodies from back in the day, not easy to find nowadays. And looking at these O-ring seal packs, I'm going to go with the white seals, and I'm not going to be running the red seals in the shock absorbers. And these are other small parts that go into making up the shock absorbers, including the shock shafts. And these are the original grey mouldings that form up the lower seal, but I'm not going to use those. We're going to put those to one side. I'm not going to use them in these shocks. We're going to swap those out for the purple anodized alloy seal housings, and I can't recommend these enough. They actually seal far better than the plastic. The plastic ones tend to leak, whereas these ones, I've never had them leak on me yet. So anyway, let's install the E-clips onto the shock shaft so we can get the piston. Now, they are Schumacher well known for having these adjustable pistons, and you'll see a little peg there. And I've just tried to show you in as fine a detail as possible that there is a slot there in the top side of that second piece that make up that piston, and you can actually move that piston around. It'll click in 4 different positions, so you'll have 1 hole open, or 2 or 3 or 4 holes open. So I've chosen to go 4 holes open at this point, not particularly for any tuning reason. I'm just going to leave them all open. And this is some detail here, and I don't know what it is about the plastic seal housings. Maybe they just have some reason that they leak, but the purple alloy ones really hold in nicely. And on goes the O-ring seal there. And this is the volume compensator. So Schumacher had this little section that went into that housing, which carried 2 of these little foam donuts here. And this is the orientation. The large white seal first, then the little brown plastic spacer, and then the brown grey spacer, and then the white seal. So everything's all lubed up nicely, and everything just pushes very nicely into that seal housing. It just snaps into place. Putting a little bit of oil on the shock shaft and very, very gently working it through those seals. You don't want to catch those seals and tear them. So yeah, very, very smooth, goes in very nicely. And you can see that little groove there, and that's what catches that seal, that internal piece. Now, very carefully, I'm winding on the shock ends, and we're all good there. So I find that the upper spring mount on the shock tends to be a bit tight, so I just shaved just a little bit off of flashing off there. Now, I'm filling these shocks up with 35 weight oil. Now, not for any tuning reason, but I'm just going to put some oil in it and just see how it goes. I'm pretty new to stadium truck setup, so at this point, I'm just going to make a note of the settings that I have in the shocks, and they can be adjusted later on with the correct oil, coils, and piston settings. So yeah, very smooth shocks. Very nice shocks. I've never had any issues with these shocks. On with the white coils and the lower spring perch, and snapping the adjusters into place. So yeah, it's time now to mount these shock absorbers to the Storm truck. And they're all set up the same front and rear, so I'm not too fussed about which goes where. Now onto those screws, mounting screws, we've got the plastic mouldings that space the top of the shock absorber out with these little balls in which the top of the shock absorber run on, and I find these allow the shock to pivot and swivel around nicely. They don't just lock squarely into place, they allow it to work freely. And on go the front piece of the moulding, and then the M3 nylock nuts, and boom, they're in place and everything's nice and smooth. Now onto the rear, same process, everything's the same as the front, snapping into place, and yeah, that's the shock absorbers all on the truck. Now it's time to open up this bag, and let's mount the rear motor guard and also the front bumper. Looking at the wheels, this is, they run on a dual front bearing, so they have a taper, or what would you call them, a step bearing or a top hat bearing or a flanged bearing. So yeah, they hold the wheels onto that shaft. So we're talking old school here. This is how they did it back then. They run on bearings, they didn't run on a pre-mounted hub. Onto the rear now, and just winding the washer on and the nut to hold the wheel onto that big hex drive at the rear. a bit of playing around just to get it to sit there nicely. Holding the drive shaft in place just to get that nut tight enough, and now on goes the front bumper. So you've got a couple of screws and a spacer which hold that front bumper, and same with the rear motor guard. You've got a couple of screws at the top which fasten into the back of the transmission, and a couple of M3 taper screws to go into through the underside of the chassis. Now I'm just checking this now for the first time with a LiPo battery pack, and it's the low center of gravity pack sits in very, very nicely, so no issues at all there. I'll be able to put a bit of sponge at the rear or at the front, and you can move that battery forward or rearwards depending on where you want to weight bias. Now onto the Lexan body. So here we go. Be very careful with your knife with this, but I like to use this score and snap method, so I very carefully trace as best I can, just a little away from the cut line, which gives me a chance to tidy it up later on. So, and thank goodness I did, because I'm not the most accurate with a knife, but I take my body scissors and I just trim the first section, and then I'm very carefully peeling it across where that score mark is. Sometimes I'll bend the Lexan back and forward just enough to get that Lexan to come away on that line. So I do a better job of it on this side. But yeah, I'm no grandmaster at running a hobby knife around a Lexan body like this, and to those who do it well, good on you. I'm still not the best, but very carefully I'm scoring it, and again just trimming it with a pair of scissors and just tearing it across that score line. And I find that's the neatest way for me to trim out a body, because I'm not running scissors up alongside the body too and marking it everywhere. Taking out my trusty Dremel with a sanding piece. I've already been doing a bit of sanding just to straighten up those lines and make them look a bit nice, but this is a good example to show anyone who hasn't already thought of this. But this is what I do just to tidy up my Lexan bodies after I've trimmed them out. I'll be very careful about running the sanding disc lightly across these faces, just enough so I can take it back to the line or where it looks nice. So you can make adjustments with these wheels. They're very handy and very simple to use. So yeah, a Dremel won't cost a great deal of money. It might be only a couple $100, but geez, it makes such a difference to all your hobby needs. Yeah, it's a great tool to have, and this just is another example of where you can use a Lexan body. So here we are, it's all done. This has been a long video, so thank you very much for those who've chosen to stop around and watch this one till the very end. And with that said, why would I make such a crazy long video? It's been such a long time since I've done one of these build videos, but this is something that's quite rare to see, especially a new built one from a kit. And, you know, the idea behind my concept with getting this thing up and going really has been for a friend of mine, or a friend of everyone's actually. His name is Scott Guyett, up in Queensland, here in Australia. And he's had quite a history with the Schumacher brand over many, many years, and I'm not sure where he's at racing now, but last year he came down to the Bash and he did some commentary, and he was fantastic. The knowledge that Scott has is just, it just blows my mind. He understands the history, the cars, the racing, you know, all the things that go into the racing. You know, he can pinpoint certain things that have even happened at events that stretch back 20 odd years. So yeah, I said to Scott, him and I would talk very early on, I'd say mid-2000s, when I was just getting into this vintage thing, and I was making some inquiries, and he mentioned that, you know, there was a Storm 2000 truck, and I said, well, I've never seen any evidence of one ever being around. So over such a long time I've been looking and kept my eye out, and I did have one many years ago. I built from parts, and unfortunately I passed it on because these 2000 series weren't considered vintage, and they weren't really being raced or run at any vintage event that I was going to. So I parted ways with it because I thought I'd never find a use for it. But all these years later, they fit now. So this is a truck that can be run. And yeah, so Scott and I used to compare notes back then over the phone, and yeah, like all these years later, a kit came up, and I just had to have it, and had to build it, and I had to make a video, because you'll probably never see another one on YouTube ever again. So this may be the only kit build you'll ever see. And so this is an absolute minty, brand new truck. I'm very impressed with it. I absolutely love it to death. Yeah, I'll never part with it now. So sorry, Scott, you're welcome to borrow it, but I can't just give it away. But this is going to be yours for the Vintage Bash 3.0. You can get it out there on the track. You can race Lou, and you can have an absolute blast and bring back and relive some old memories with a truck that you had some fun experiences with back in the mid-90s, I would say. And anyway, so it's been a long video, and sorry, but anyway, this is online for people to check out, and you know, they can actually see what the Storm 2000 is all about. And the next time you see this, it'll be painted, it'll have electronics in it, and no doubt I'll be behind a camera or the drone capturing this thing in action around a dirt track. And yeah, good times ahead. So anyway, thank you very much for everyone who chose to stop in and check out this video. And no doubt there'll be more to follow. So thanks very much. Have a good day, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye now.